Welcome to Schmidt List. Today, we're exploring the art and strategy of branding with Brad Flowers, founder of Bullhorn, a leading branding agency. Brad, an expert in creating compelling brand names and the author of The Naming Book, will share his insights on how naming has changed with tech advances and market shifts. Whether you're a startup founder, a marketing pro, or fascinated by branding, Brad's advice and strategies will shed light on branding today.
Brad, it's so good to see you. So tell me about what Bullhorn does and what do you do there as a member of Bullhorn?
Bullhorn is a branding agency. We do naming, visual and verbal identity, and brand launch, 3 things. And I founded the company in 2008. So I do a little bit of everything. But when client work, I really mainly work on naming projects because it's what I like the best. I'll also plug a book. I wrote a book called The Naming Book. It's getting great reviews. It's getting mixed reviews on Amazon, but I think a lot of people probably like it.
Yeah, I like that book. It's a great book. I'll put a link in the description for folks down there below. Brad, yeah, I'm so glad you're here because I want to talk to you specifically, being a naming expert on the rise of generative artificial intelligence and what it means. Naming has gone through a lot over the last 20 years, right? Because all of a sudden, it wasn't just naming, we had domain names show up, right? And so we had to get our .com. So a lot of people were almost backing into naming, it felt like, as if the .com was available, then we could name it. It wasn't really necessarily, did this a good fit for our business and our values and representative? We need to make sure we get the .com. And now we're kind of entering this world of naming where a lot of people have been talking about how it's impacting marketing and copywriting and all the different things, especially around those sorts of things. So can you walk me through a little bit of some of the recent history with naming and some of the challenges that you've seen and some of the changes over the years? I'd love to get your perspective on what's been happening in naming the last few years.
Yeah, that's a good question. The big shift, and my dog's going to come in. Great. In the yellow pages, everything was AAA, which didn't make any sense. And then there was the .com, whatever obscure word .com. Social handles had a lot to do with certain businesses for a while. What social handles were available was a big part of the criteria. And recently, with more domain extensions, we've had a bit of a renaissance of more interesting names again it became a little more open again. And so it felt like names became more interesting and people are interested in the architecture of product naming. How do all of the names fit underneath the parent brand name? Some of the questions we're getting is in relation to the architecture stuff, which is kind of interesting. And then the other one is service businesses and business to business organizations are starting to care about their name, where before it was pretty common to just have founder, and founder. We're here to meet your architecture, your CPA, whatever it is, needs.
Firms, architecture firms, lots of those places are always like partner named, right?
Yeah. And so that's been a fair amount of the work we've done. Actually, we've done a lot of business to business work, a lot of professional services work. And so in that space, it's interesting because they don't really care as much what the customers think, but they're really interested in getting a name that matches with their culture. And so it sort of changes a little bit how the naming organization goes about creating the name, because that cultural exploration is really more important than any sort of customer insight or customer profile. So those are just a few things that we're thinking about.
That's interesting because let me ask you this. And when you go about naming, if you do have a B2C to consumer versus a B2B, like what's usually your advice for how to go about naming? Because I would imagine if I'm doing a B2C, I want something that resonates more with the customer than maybe my organization. And when I'm B2B, I want to have something that resonates more with my organization, or do I want something that resonates more with the customer? How do you guide people down that path? What sort of questions should they be asking themselves?
Yeah. In the B2B space, I think our general advice is the name should be a reflection of your culture, but also it should make sense as a brand name fit. Cultural.
Ball pit and dogs.
Yeah. Dogs in the office.co. It needs to fit in. So our first step is going to be setting out the criteria. It's sort of like a creative brief, but really specific to the name. And we're going to walk through that client and develop a list of hard and soft criteria. Some of the hard stuff, what we've talked about, which would be yes, no answers. What kind of domain availability is there? And that can be defined around what they care about. Did they care about a short domain, a .com, a .ai, whatever, social handles, those other kind of yes, no. And then also there will be a whole host of softer criteria. Is it on what kind of tones do you want the name to convey? How do you talk about the values of your company? What would that sound like in a name? And we would potentially go through, here are lists of names in your space, like generally what's happening. And in people, usually there will be pretty clear trends in most industries. So it's going to be real words, or some industries have longer names, but we would go through, here are the trends. And do you want to start making some purposeful decisions? Do you want to stand in on purpose and kind of like fit in and look more established? That might be a great strategy. If you're a new organization, especially if you're a new business to business organization and you want to have credibility right out of the gap, you might want something that sounds like it fits in. If you want to sound like you're innovative, you might want to stand out. It's matching both culture and then also your business strategy. So it's kind of like, how do you marry those two things? And that's mainly what we would be doing in a business to business environment. And business to B2C is a little different. Like most of our clients, if it's B2C, they're coming with a fair amount of consumer research. We don't really do that, but they're saying these are sort of the people we think it should resonate with.
So I was going to ask, is it also more competitor? Like you take competitors into much deeper thought when it comes to the direct to consumer brands versus a B2B?
In the B2B, we don't look at competitors really in any way other than to kind of like identify what trend lines are. And in B2C, it's definitely a little bit more, how do we kind of stand apart from this and create a little bit of gap? And again, it's like, what's the name trying to do on a shelf? It's trying to buy you like that 10th of a second that the rest of the packaging can kind of complete the idea. So whether it's a certain ingredient or whatever the particular draw is, you just don't have a ton of time. And so if the name can gauge a little bit of interest, just to let some of the design do the work, let some of the other brand language do the work. That's some of what we're thinking of. How does it all work together?
Sense. Yeah. And brand is and again, it goes back to, it's a different art form than your traditional sort of marketing approach in the way that Gen AI is affecting paid search and media buying and blogging and all those sorts of things. But I'm guessing it is affecting your business in some way. Tell me, how are you using Gen AI these days in the work that you're doing? How is it either augmenting, or are there areas where you're trying to stay away from? Tell me about what the benefits and the downsides have been for you using it.
Yeah. I think we probably lagged some of those other industries that you mentioned in impact with generative AI, partly because we're trying to create something that's going to last for 10 years. We're not trying to latch onto something that's sort of like a trend this quarter or this month.
Something that's going to be an ad for a week.
Yeah. So the time horizon is a little different. And I think that might have something to do with it. I'm not really sure. I haven't thought that much about why. But so in our work right now, there are some questions around trademarking and what would be available for trademark. So like for name generation, for example, we don't use any sort of generative AI to generate actual names. But for example, I was working on a project last week and I got to a point, I was a little bit stuck, and I was thinking about the prompt and I put it in. I work at a naming agency. We're working with a client in this specific industry. What sort of avenues might you pursue if you were a naming expert? And then it kind of listed out a few different ideas of potential directions to drill down, because I think that's when you run into a dead end, it's sort of like, okay, what now? And so then just to help shake out some of the cobwebs of, okay, I've looked at this and this. And then I dug into a couple of different things and it helped me come up with a few names that I maybe wouldn't have thought of. We've used it a little to kind of say what sort of, once we have a name list that we're going to propose to the client, we'll kind of ask the AI what they think some of the associations in the consumer's mind might come to the surface with a particular name. And that works okay. Most of the time it seems like, I think partly we're learning how to do it. It's
Oh,
maybe not
sure.
AI, it's maybe us. So I think it wants to make you happy. And so it's, oh, these are great names. You should have a lot of success with this name.
It does
I
want to
think
make you happy.
I think as we get better, we can kind of ask better prompts, and as the AIs get more complicated. That's a little
Makes
bit of how
sense.
we're doing it. So in the naming space specifically, with the brand work, there are all sorts of AI plugins already into Adobe products that we use. One of the biggest time savers that I've seen is around photography. We'll often need some photography assets for clients. And
Yeah.
for example, this is like a really dumb one, but we just worked for a company who they own a bunch of like orthodontists offices across the country. And if you go down the rabbit hole of searching for stock images of people with braces, it's like a pretty tough spot. You don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time there. And what would have taken a long time to put braces on a person that didn't have them now is just like a couple of buttons. So there's stuff like that that's kind of, that's a bit of a time saver.
That's really funny.
But yeah.
No, it's a great example. I mean,
Who can
again,
you put braces on? That was really time consuming, and they do it really fast.
I was going to say there's probably some really niche things where it can really help out in versus give me people in a business meeting. Oh, everybody's wearing braces. There's all got braces.
Right.
You know,
needs to be a happy multicultural group of business people in braces.
Yes, exactly. That's where AI is really going to shine. And that's the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because I have seen a lot of businesses, and we at my agency, we work with a lot of large places, and I've been talking to a lot of other agency owners, and I'm seeing some places even requesting as part of their NDAs saying you won't use AI in the work. Because again, back to your point about copyright law and all these other things, they're nervous that this is a new lawsuit area that's really shined up. I just want to get your opinion on that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, every client definitely wants to know how we're using it. And like I was working, that name I mentioned earlier where I sort of was stuck. She was like, "You're not just going to give me an AI name, are you? I could do that." And I was like, "Let me explain the process again." We will not be giving you an AI
since
name.
2008. That's what
We've been doing it this way. And we won't do it this way forever, most likely. But as of today, this is what we're doing. Yeah. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense if I were spending, I mean, it's expensive to go through a branding process. It's time consuming, which therefore it's expensive. And the expertise of the person you're paying for is also expensive. I mean, I totally understand it. I would want to know how it was being used. And if I'm buying something that I would consider intellectual property and then finding out it was AI generated and is in fact not intellectual property, I'd be upset. So I totally get it. And we're kind of evolving and responding to our clients depending on their particular concerns and just trying to be as flexible as possible. Yeah, because it's just not clear. It seems like things are happening really quickly, and
yeah, they really are.
As much as you can just be honest and say, we don't really know, but this is our best guess right now, and we'll respond to your concerns.
Yeah, we'll go from there. Yeah, and that's the thing is that I feel like, again, there's this whole new sort of world that has been created around us with generative AI. But then you've also got things like fast fashion, right? You got the Sheins of the world, the H&Ms, those sorts of things. You got this sort of seemingly low cost sort of solutions for these things. But again, we keep going back to, and like you said, like getting the real stuff is expensive. So you're still just in a world where you're getting what you pay for. Because I've been using AI for years, and I think it's really nice, but I'm not, it's not going to take over the world in my opinion. Like, it's not that bright. It's right. Really not. And I get it. Like, it's going to improve all the time, but it would have to improve a lot for me to be impressed at this point, because there's just too many nuances to how people interact, not just with each other, but with brands and other types of things, right? Because you've got emotions attached to a lot of these things. Because again, we're talking about buying. Again, what's the purpose of having a brand in the first place, right? You want to stand out. Why? Because you want people to buy your brand, buy into your brand, buy products from your brand.
And that's
You know?
and that's a niche we should get into is custom golf club
Yeah.
branding. Or I like the boat idea. That's pretty fun. Like,
Well, but
we
again,
got-
it's ego. You see some of these ego-driven things, and I think the most famous one right now is X versus Twitter, right?
yeah.
You've got a brand that is like a generational type brand, like a Coca-Cola or something, the name Twitter, right? And then this guy comes in and is X is cool, bro. Don't you like X better? And people are like, no. And
Yeah.
again, like
It's-
we've seen this. We've seen this year after year. I mean, New Coke. Remember, if you're old enough to
Yep.
remember, in the 80s,
Yep.
Coke was like, you know what? We can improve Coca-Cola. So here's New Coke, and people were like, you can you can jump off a cliff is what you can do.
Yeah, forget it.
Yeah, to forget it. And people don't like that. People don't appreciate that. I would love to get your opinion on the Twitter X thing, being a branding and naming person. What was going through your thoughts when that transition happened?
I didn't think it would ever. I thought it was one of those like larks, or it was like, oh yeah, this is a cool idea, and then wisdom would prevail, but wisdom did not prevail.
It did not.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is really interesting, where the people who grew up and they really identify, there's an emotional resonance to Twitter.
Yeah.
And I think by a lot of standards of what a name should do, it's a quite successful name. You know, it's like really evocative of the product. It's sort of an onomatopoeia. You sort of see it. And so there are these memorability hooks that are built into the name. The hard T's tend to make it more memorable. It's easy to spell and pronounce for English speakers anyway. So I think by some objective standards, it's a pretty good name. And apart from the emotional connection people have to it, and the X is just sort of, it just seems out of left field.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like somebody trying too hard is what it feels like. I mean, I'm sure that's something you've seen in branding over the years, and especially in naming, where you can tell when people are just trying too hard.
Yeah, trying too hard. It's funny. I sometimes think there's this sort of, sometimes I think politics are on this spectrum where like the further you go around, it's not really a spectrum, but it's more of a loop. And so trying too hard and not trying hard enough eventually get really close to each other at the top. And
The line is too hard to see.
yeah, they're kind of kissing cousins. Those sorts of brands just kind of like fall to the wayside. So it becomes like something that talks about, that's why the X thing with Twitter has been surprising in the duration. It's like the stubbornness of it. I assumed it was just like a lot of times it's something will come to the surface and then it falls away.
Yeah.
This one of those cases where it is not.
And I think the also thing that kind of bothers me about it too is that it's overtly masculine, right? So
Yeah.
it's like when you name when they're naming cars, right? If you look at like trucks and stuff, right? Like the Raptor and the Duramax, and like I know who they're marketing those vehicles to, right? And it feels like that, which I feel like kind of shuts off accessibility in a case to a brand when, and I'm sure that's something you have to test, right? When you're out there naming things, how does this appeal to different ages and genders and things like that, right?
And I was thinking about the trucks, and then like Raptor, like Rivian hits in a totally different sort of way.
Oh yeah. It's right down the middle.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's like all this kind of nature imagery. It definitely doesn't feel overtly feminine or masculine. So it's unique, and it's been thoughtfully crafted as a name. Whether you like it or not, it's immaterial. Do I love the name? Who cares? Doesn't really matter. It was thoughtfully made, decided upon, and it feels like it has a perspective. I don't know. Where X maybe feels like it has a perspective, it's just someone you wouldn't want to hear from.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
the problem. It's like that's the person I want to tune out.
Yeah, exactly. Often is X.
Yeah, we do, and I think at some point maybe AI will be useful for this. As of right now, we still use real humans, but in the naming process, before we would pitch any name, we run it by a test group of people and present the names, and we don't ask like, how do you like this one? It's what kind of initial reactions do you have? And then now that I tell you a little bit of more story and show you an image with it, then how does that change how you feel about it? And then at the end, and the company's trying to do X, Y, and Z. How would you rate it 1 to 10 on, is it more or less successful? And so that's how we try to get at naming is hard to test in that way, frankly, because everyone has strong opinions about words because we all use words, whether we're talking, writing, whatever. We kind of feel like we're sort of experts. So it's definitely a bit hard to test, and you have to kind of create this sort of tight artificial environment in order to do it, or else people are just like, a lot of times the initial response is, if it's really obvious, it's love it. Or if it feels a little bit strange or uncomfortable, like, ooh, I hate it. This is not a good name.
Yeah. You get that initial ew, right?
Yeah. And it's hard to tell like what sort of name might grow on somebody versus, because a lot of times right up front, it's that this feels comfortable and it makes me feel good, or this is uncomfortable and it makes me feel bad. But sometimes that's good. Like, you need to feel a little uncomfortable, because if everything was the same, especially, nothing's going to stand off the shelf, and how are you going to have a shot?
No, it makes sense. As part of my last question here is that one of the other things that's happened this year is that I've been reading a lot about this, about how a lot of non-competes have gone away in the country, and all these. And there's estimates of over 80,000 new businesses will get started this year because of this non-compete clause being terminated. If somebody's listening to this, Brad, and they are considering, I'm going to start my own business, and I'm going to start doing my own consulting, I'm going to start doing whatever the case may be, and they're trying to think of, because it's hard for us not to think about, what does it look like on a business card when we're starting? You get all excited, right? You get giddy. What am I going to call it? What's the name of it? And that's usually what a lot of people ask you, like the first question when you tell them, like, oh, I'm starting a business and we're going to do this. Oh, what's the name of it? Yep. So if you were to give that solopreneur maybe some advice right now, and like how to go about starting to come up with a name, how would you guide them?
First off, I was joking about the naming book earlier. I actually wrote it exactly with that person in mind. I wrote it for the solopreneur, the early entrepreneur who needs to come up with a name and then just wants to move on and never think about naming again. It's like, a lot of naming books are really intended for naming experts. And this book is meant for the naming layperson. You don't need to have any background, any knowledge of naming. You don't need to have a big linguistic bag of tricks. Just show up with some paper and pen. So truthfully, the first thing I would do is buy the naming book if I were you. And actually, it's $20 or less. Anyway, so it lays out the 3 steps: developing criteria, name generation, and deciding. And with deciding comes some other things like trademarking, et cetera. Name criteria is the thing most people skip. Most people jump straight to, okay, I'm going to start like searching weird words, or I have an idea of what it's going to be, so I'm going to start brainstorming. Always start off with naming criteria, because unless you have an idea of what it takes to be successful, you'll never know at the end if you found it or not. And so taking the time to go through, build out the criteria, the name, the book really like lays out exactly how to do that. Pretty straightforward. And then also it gives a bunch of different hooks or different sorts of ways that we create bigger naming lists, because it's pretty common for us to develop 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 names for a project, depending on the particular industry. And it gives some ideas of how we do that. And then at the end, reviewing your criteria and thinking not so much which name do I like the best, but which name best meets my criteria. And you can even create a little matrix in Google Sheets or Excel or something. And so you have some objective data. So it's not just totally subjective. And then I would also hire an attorney to help with the trademarking process too. And there are also some tools you can use. So different attorneys, and also there are new AI powered tools that are doing some preliminary trademark screening, which has been very time consuming and burdensome in the past. So that's something that's pretty cool. That's another new thing that's coming up. It's sort of, it's not exactly like a core AI, but it's a wraparound tool.
Sure.
But definitely want to make sure that you don't get way down with a business and end up with a name that you can't use. That's so disappointing. And it's expensive. Yeah. Spend a little bit of money up front to make sure that you can use it.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest for sure. I think the naming book is a great resource. And I would say that whether or not you were here or not, because I found it to be super helpful in going through, even naming my own consulting business. I utilized a lot of the book from there. But I also have learned over the years, you got to have some fun with it too. Don't make it a dry thing. So it was really interesting finding those sorts of non-tangibles that go along with a brand, I guess, which trying to source those non-tangibles about how they make you feel when you hear them versus what they represent, I guess.
I talk a lot about using metaphors for, this is one of those like kind of scary linguistic terms, but you don't have to go back to 10th grade English. But using metaphors to help dive deeper into more interesting things. And so like, for example, some people say, this is actually a simile, but they would say Bullhorn is like business therapy or something. When we go through the process, like clients actually say that to us. You guys are like business therapists. And so if I were renaming Bullhorn today, that would be the top of one of my categories would be like therapist. And then I'm going to go down and like the sorts of words you generate are going to be different than if it's branding agency at the top. Branding agency, you have to constantly twist it and turn it and look at what you're doing from different angles and different perspectives. And that's how you do it. And whatever way in works for you, whether it's like imagining it as a band or thinking about it, how would I describe a psychotherapist? And then you can start creating and combining words in really interesting ways. That's something that feels unique. And it also feels because it comes from reflection you or your culture, it feels naturally like an extension. And it doesn't, again, it like helps you get out of that trying too hard trap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you also have to think about all the different applications at some point too, when it comes to your business, right? Because I remember I never thought about this till when I was in design school and we had to design our first marks. And they were like, oh, I remember working on mine and the professor was like, oh, you could never fax this. And I was like, oh, shoot.
Embroidering that's the killer.
Embroidering. Yeah. Right.
Maybe
Embroidering.
Too detailed.
Yeah. Or things like that. So there's way past now I've got the name, but now I've got to think about how is it going to be represented visually and how does it work for the company? How is it like a member of the team, I guess, versus this theoretical like thing that floats above you all? Because it's got to put in work, that name, right?
It has to put in work. And I think in my opinion, the biggest thing it probably does in the long term is give you more confidence. And so if you can't say it and feel sort of like a confidence boost, then it's probably the wrong thing. And it could be the wrong thing because it's like, I wasn't trying hard enough or it just doesn't feel like me or whatever it is. You should feel good saying it because that's initially we described that as the bar test or maybe the coffee shop test is more accessible. If you could say it like across the room, could you say it confidently and could people understand what you're saying? Those are some of the tests that are like, does it work or does it not work?
I love that idea. Yeah. Again, it's out in the real world. It's alive.
Yeah.
It's part of an ecosystem. It's part of this society. Right. And yeah, I love that perspective. If I couldn't shout it across thing and be like, oh, just contact Bullhorn. Yeah. I love that perspective, Brad.
Yeah.
Okay, Brad, I could talk to you all day because you're fantastic to talk to. Thank you for taking the time and sharing with us today. So I will have links to the naming book down below in the description. But Brad, if I want to get in touch with you, if I want to learn more about Bullhorn's work, if I want to see some of the stuff you've done and I maybe want to use you for some services in the future, where should I go?
Yeah, you can see our work on our site at bullhorncreative.com. And I think we're pretty much everywhere on the internet at Bullhorn Creative. And you can email me at brad@bullhorncreative.
Thanks so much for taking your time in your busy day to spend with me. I really appreciate it, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do it.
We appreciate you taking the time to listen to this episode of Schmidt List. The stories shared by our guests are genuinely inspiring and offer insightful knowledge. It's important to remember that success doesn't happen overnight and requires collaboration, learning, and perseverance. If you want to broaden your professional connections, check out Kurt's book, The Little Book of Networking, How to Build Your Career One Conversation at a Time on Amazon. Please stay connected with all things Schmidt List on social media, leave a review for the podcast, and join our community of like-minded entrepreneurs. Thank you for being part of Schmidt List. Keep innovating, collaborating, and chasing your entrepreneurial dreams.